In this age, uttering the word slave is taboo like no other. With this word comes the heavy history of raids, incarceration, and trade of human beings, especially black African men and women. The rise of Islam in the 7th century cleared a path for many invasions centered around spreading it as the one and only true religion. These campaigns gave rise to the usual post-war phenomena like looting and taking slaves. The Islamic influence spread east of the Arabian Peninsula, also engorging vast areas of North Africa in the southwest. With control of these vast lands came immense opportunity to catch and sell black slaves from south of the Sahara Desert. The demand of cheap labor in the West due to increasing economic activities panned out to be one of the major reasons for increased slave trade in Europe and America. Slave trade in Africa grew tremendously from the 7th century up until the 19th century, with some researchers estimating the caught and sold slaves to be around 11.5 to 14 million within a span of 1,300 years. Welcome to Bizarre History. Today we delve into the terrifying history of the Arab slave trade. If you studied basic modern history, know the advent of religion was the basic pillar of all medieval-era wars. Islam stepped into North Africa 7 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 639, with the help of 4,000 soldiers invading from Mecca, but later retreated south in fear of the Byzantine fleet, which was majorly Christian, finding the city of Cairo in the process. Slave transportation from Central Africa and towards the north was well known, as slaves had been transported along the same route since ancient times by the Egyptians. But how did the Arabs use these routes? Well, the Arabs would transport black slaves caught from the Middle Africa through the Sahara Desert and sell them to Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. These were mostly from the Kanem-Borneo Empire until the 8th century, and later the Mali Empire from 13th to 15th century. The Arabs in the north would frequently distinguish themselves from the light-skinned slaves by using the word Zanji, or Sudan, meaning black. Were these the only routes used by the Arabs? Actually, no. These were the most popular and economic ones, but slaves were also transported eastward to India and China through India from the island of Zanzibar near the modern-day Tanzania. Muslim rulers' slave trading began after they won the Swahili coast along with the Swahili traders. These traders captured the Bantu tribe of Africans, better known as Zanji, from the Middle Africa near the modern-day lands of Kenya, Mozambique, and Tanzania. They were gathered near the coast with high concentrations in Unguja and Pemba Islands, and later sold off to the east, sometimes through Madagascar, navigating the Indian Ocean. 1,000 slaves were traded annually between the 8th and 17th centuries, a number that grew to 4,000 near the end of the 18th century. We create an image of a black man when the word slave is uttered, but African Zanji people were not the only types of slave bought and sold by the Arabs. Between the 16th and 19th century, a group of independent lands known as Barbary states regularly conducted raids on Netherlands, Ireland, South Britain, going as far as Iceland from Italy to capture white slaves. These trades occurred along the Barbary coast of North Africa, including the states of Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripolitania. These white slaves were given a higher status than the black slaves, and would sometimes go on to acquire higher positions of power, a luxury not instilled in black slaves. The Barbary pirates are assumed to have captured about 1 million Europeans in North Africa between the 16th and 18th centuries. In between all this chaos in Europe and the Middle East in the Middle Ages, the spilling of the slave markets to other parts of the world was inevitable. Zanzibar Island was already supplying slaves to India and China. Historians claim to have evidence of black slaves reaching as far as Japan. One such documented case of slave purchase was that of the Tang dynasty of China, whose royals purchased a lot of European and Jewish slaves. People also tell tales of Yazuki, the first black samurai, who entered Japan as a slave with missionaries but ended up on the good side of Oda Nobunaga, who ended up taking him on retainer. Although the more popular discussions state that Yazuki was hailed as a samurai, historians argue this and state that he was just inducted as a warrior in the feudal army. Going towards east, Muslim campaigns would also reach northern India and modern-day Pakistan through the Middle East or Central Asia, where approximately 100,000 people were enslaved by raiders. Those areas were already occupied by a small percentage of people following Islam, but they were killed regardless, and their families were enslaved. The history class in school wasn't fun for many of us. A lot was taught to us in schools and universities about slaves and how they were caught and sold. People, while discussing the topic of slavery, only accused Arabs or Europeans of pushing black people into slavery through warfare, giving a clean chit to other people. What most people don't know is that for many of the times, black people were sold off to the Arabs by their own kin in return for some payment or to settle debts. It was very common in the Middle Ages in Africa for black rulers or landlords to own slaves, which they would end up selling off to the Arabs. The hard-to-digest truth is that, in one way, the Middle African rulers acted as middlemen, rounding up people from the nearby villages to be sold to the Arabs for profit. In one instance, when Ibn Battuta, a Berber explorer, visited the ancient African kingdom of Mali, he noted that people with fewer slaves were looked at with contempt by their neighbors and was himself offered a slave boy as a gift. War was the more known and large-scale method of enslaving people, as warlords, after winning a territory, would march people off to their own lands to sell them as slaves or sell them to the highest bidders in the neighboring states. The Arabs also used many strategies to nab children in Africa, luring them into traps using dates and later selling them off in their own land. Africa, as we all know, is the richest continent in terms of mineral resources. During that point of time in Africa, clothing and food were the major imports, and slaves, coconuts, and gold were the major exports. The roles given to slaves varied from irrigation, mining, transport, public works, etc. for male slaves, and harem guards, secretaries, concubines, commercial agents, etc. for women. Both male and female slaves had different roles, but male slaves were preferred over the female ones for hard labor such as mining, crop plantations, and construction. Female slaves, which are often overlooked by us, were in a state of even greater agony than their male counterparts. They were often captured just for the sake of producing more slaves, but if the parents of the unborn child accepted Islam, which in most cases they did, the child would be born free. Most historians believe all this was a ruse to spread Islam even further. When it couldn't go any worse for the slaves, they were sometimes castrated. These slaves were given special positions by rulers like treasury guards or harem helpers. Even though Prophet Muhammad prohibited castration, eunuchs were common in the Middle East. For a long time, the gatekeeper of Mecca were eunuchs, as they were considered pure. People would kiss their hands to pay them their respect before entering for prayer. If I were to ask you where you thought the slave trade was most prominent in the world, you'd probably think of America, right? Well, most of the slave trading took place in the Mediterranean Sea and the area surrounding it. Major slave trading hubs were Morocco, Algeria, Tripoli, and Cairo. Most of the slaves which were ever sold were made to cross the Sahara Desert and then sold off in the Mediterranean. Many kingdoms rose and fell in this region, starting from the ancient Egyptians to the European colonies of modern history. But one thing that remained constant was the slave markets. In the east, Zanzibar Island was also a major hub of slave trading activities, but was different from their northern counterparts, as the people of the Swahili coast were themselves involved in capturing and selling of the natives of the land. It is also believed that the merchants of the Swahili coast themselves lured in many Islamic landlords or emperors to rule over them so that they could profit from the slave trading activities. Towards the West Coast, commonly known as the Gold Coast or Ivory Coast, was also notorious for its slave trading activities. Although it was mostly controlled by European colonizers between the 16th and 19th centuries, the Arabs were also involved in selling Africans to North and South America. This is the part that most of us get right, but don't appreciate enough due to our unending freedom rights. The living conditions of the slaves were inhumane, but the slaves under Islamic law had some rights, unlike their Christian counterparts, who were treated like commodities. 3/4 of the slaves who were made to travel across the Sahara Desert died due to starvation, exhaustion, disease, or all of them. Those who survived were sold off to the highest bidder and were made to work in extremely dangerous conditions in mines or plantations, devoting up to 20 hours of their day digging, sowing seed and planting, or harvesting crops for their owners. African slaves were purposefully starved as to weaken them and make them more docile. Male slaves were often castrated so they could not hinder the female slave's capacity for childbirth. Female slaves, being less in demand, suffered more agony than their male counterparts. Most of the women slaves were only held as concubines or on breeding farms to produce more slaves. Slaves were punished for not working fast enough, for being late getting to the fields, for defying authority, for running away, and for a number of other reasons. The punishments took many forms, including whippings, torture, mutilation, imprisonment, and being sold away from the plantation. The conditions of slaves in ancient times were luxurious compared to those of slaves in the Middle Ages. Some historians also state that the living conditions of a slave were better than those of peasants during ancient times, as slaves were looked after more often and fed regularly. Slavery in the 21st century? Don't be ridiculous. Well, modern-day slavery, by definition, is when an individual is exploited by others for personal or commercial gain. Whether tricked, coerced, or forced, they lose their freedom. Although slavery was abolished and eradicated from most of the world by the middle of the 20th century, some vices of the society preserved it in its most gruesome form in different parts of the world. Many Eastern European women from Belarus or Ukraine, who are renowned around the world for their beauty, are tricked and sold in Turkish markets and pushed into bonded prostitution even to this day. Many migrants from West Central and Sahelian Africa, heading to Europe because of unrest in their countries, are sold as slaves after being detained by human smugglers or militia groups. Yemen is the only country in the world right now with a growing slave population. Yemen is still a developing country that has been in political turmoil since 2011. A local media group investigated an anonymous lead that led them to the revelation that people were still enslaved in Yemen and were also actively being sold to Brazil and Saudi Arabia for hefty prices. If you liked today's video, you will thoroughly enjoy the next one up on your screens. Make sure to subscribe so never missing out on the horrors of history. And as always, thanks for watching Bizarre History.